So everyone, please take your seats because we are starting the next panel. It's called Delegates, Immigration, Agents, and Treaty Making. My name is Aileen Friesen, and I am the chair of this panel. I'm going to introduce the presenters, and then they will come up in order. So our first presenter is Ernest Braun. He is a career English teacher at Niverville Collegiate and an independent historical researcher after retirement. His published works include the Historical Atlas of the East Reserve with co-editor Dr. Glenn Clausen and various articles in Mennonite print media, including in Preservings, and he has awards including a Lieutenant Governor Award for Historical Preservation and Promotion in 2014. Our next presenter after Ernest is Blake Hamm, who is a practicing lawyer, trained negotiator, and independent researcher based in Selkirk, Manitoba. He has worked in various positions in politics, policy, and law, and has a master's in international affairs. His articles have been published in the Journal of Mennonite Studies and the Mennonite Quarterly Review. He is conversational in Plautdeutsch, for those of you who are looking for a conversation partner, having learned it while being his uncle's Scheckbengel in the Ottawa Valley. I think many of us have experience of being Scheckbengels in this community. The third presenter is Dr. Ryan Eyford, who is an associate professor in the Department of History at the University of Winnipeg, where he teaches Indigenous and Canadian history. Dr. Eyford has published several articles on the history of the Icelanders in North America and is the author of White Settler Reserve, New Iceland and the Colonization of the Canadian West. He is not Mennonite, but he is married to one, so we have to embrace him as one of our own. And finally, Dr. Patricia Harms is a Latin American historian, focusing specifically on Guatemala, and her work focuses on women's histories in Guatemala City, as well as transnational movements in which they were involved. She has a number Latina Social Activism in Guatemala City was published in 2020 by University of New Mexico Press and has received several awards. She is involved in several SHIRK projects in northern Manitoba, as well as research on women and gender in Central America. So those are our presenters, and they will each come up in whatever order they are in the program, and let's welcome them to the podium.
Thank you. So, emigration of Russian Mennonites is now on the table. Next step, of course, delegates. Just over a year ago, Blake Hamm and I were discussing the 12 1873 delegates and their visit to Manitoba in June of that year. Some of them kept journals that were later published. We noticed that we had not seen any published journals by William Ewert, a minister of West Prussia, or for that matter, Jacob Buller, of the Alexandroville colony of the Malachna, also a minister. Why is there nothing from them? A quick email to John Thiessen at Bethel College Archives revealed a cache of untranscribed letters, documents, totaling 116 scanned images, most of which were indeed letters. Letters of these two delegates, William Ewert and Jacob Buller, wrote back to their families. Of course, these letters were written in German, in what we like to prefer affectionately as Gothic script, the chicken scratches. Blake found software online to do the rough transcription, and I edited that, so 100 hours plus later, all these documents are transcribed and translated into English. And what turned up? And yes, I sent them to Conrad. And what turned up was interesting. As we all know, starting in 1873 already and continuing into the 1880s, most of the Russian Mennonites, immigrants, ended up south of the border. What is so intriguing was to hear the things that Ewert and Buller said to their families and churches back home about all this. In the interest of time, I will concentrate on Ewert only, and focus only on the comments that he made about Manitoba, because of course he wrote pages and pages and pages of other stuff. In his second letter, written to his family from Fargo, after spending some time touring Dakotas before he goes to Canada, Ewert had already seen enough to say that, after everything I've seen and heard, I have concluded that we can't look for anything better than this area. Where there is more timber, it'll either be further away from the population or the land will no longer be available in large blocks. Then, the first hint on Manitoba comes immediately after crossing the international boundary, when Ewert says, now, I guess this is to be really aggressive, non-Mennonite aggressive. The trip down the river on the international went quite well so far, but one realized immediately that one has no longer had American management. On the Canadian boat, we really missed that unassuming, courteous treatment as experienced in America from the waiter to the president. And although we paid well, the food was really bad. Then he gives himself away a little bit. When he, upon arrival in Winnipeg, we were greeted by the governor of Winnipeg with great affability, served with champagne and biscuits, and were shown the advantages of the country, since I was already biased against this country by the inquiries I had made previously. My acquaintanceship with its population aroused even more antipathy towards it. I paid very little attention to the pretenses and flattery offered us. While at Government House, Manitoba officials stressed that the township land was free of charge and entirely reserved for the Mennonites. There's the land. Ewert quickly points out that, in fact, that is not the case, since the Hudson Bay Company gets at least almost 2 sections per township, and points out that the other land elsewhere is restricted by existing Métis river lots. When he later reports on his impressions of Manitoba gleaned while here, Ewert references the Red River resistance and the struggles against the government, concluding that many of the Métis had simply given up and left. He also references Treaty 1, calling into question whether the government would be able to keep the promises they made in it. He points out, moreover, that a large immigrant settlement will drive the buffalo away, predicting that this will adversely affect the First Nations who depend on that, and will radically change the dynamics between them and the European settlers. At any rate, it seems to have been a fairly lively meeting, with the Manitoba officials offering all the advantages, and Ewert shooting them all down. And I'll give 5 examples. Canada will provide transportation from the Black Sea to Winnipeg for $55 using the all-Canadian route via the Dawson Trail. Now, you see that trail from Thunder Bay to Winnipeg. Ewert pours scorn on the Dawson route, pointing out that everything would have to be unloaded from the wagon onto the boat and vice versa about 26 times. Actually, I think that's a little understated. I think it's actually more. Noting that this part alone would add at least 4 weeks to the existing 6-week journey, almost doubling the length of the journey, and arguing that in comparison, Fargo is only 3 days from New York by train. But Manitoba, look at the market potential. Manitoba was considered to have a great advantage because all the products here are more expensive than they are in the United States. Ewert responds by saying, "Sure, but those prices will only continue until the Mennonites outproduce the small Manitoba market, and then the products will be worthless in the future." But the Mennonites can export their surplus products up the Red River to the U.S. Ewert counters with, "Sure, and the shipping company gets paid 1.5 cents per pound of freight, which is exactly as much as wheat is worth here. Oh, but Manitoba will not always depend on shipping companies because a Trans-Canada Railway is coming to Manitoba. Ewert gives no credence to that at all, saying, "We were fooled into thinking that the intention was to build a railway from the Atlantic to the Pacific, which was projected to run 40 miles from the settlement and would cost approximately $150 million, for which the necessary cash was still lacking." Oh, but consider that Manitoba has an abundance of heating material since vast supplies of coal have been discovered. For nearby, for fuel, and for export in exchange for building materials from the U.S., creating great prosperity for Manitoba. I suspect this is a reference to the coal discovered in the Turtle Mountains by the early settlers, and indeed, some coal was mined from the 1880s to 1900, and again during the Depression, but no prosperity ever resulted from it. There are indeed today millions of tons of coal there, but as recently as the 1970s, a government report stated, "The coal seams at Turtle Mountains are too thin, and the roof and the water conditions too dangerous to ever allow economic extraction of the coal by underground mining." How Ewert knew this is not clear. He sums up that whole meeting at Government House this way: "We learned that the report of the discovered coal was a ruse, that the journey on the Dawson route is life-threatening, that the reason that no grains are cultivated is that the grasshoppers destroy them." He continues on as a contrast between the USA and Manitoba, this time addressing lifestyle and alcohol. Okay. "All over America, I had encountered a lively, civilized hustle and bustle activity, for there are entire states where no brandy may be served. You can't even get beer in the railway restaurants. In Manitoba, however, old and young all cavort around in the drinking dens, bickering, gambling, and fighting." He concludes, "All this information made me come to the conclusion you must really be considered to be very stupid." And that's word for word. And all this before they've even seen the East Reserve. After overnighting at the Davis Hotel, and after the famous photograph was taken, the trek to the East Reserve finally begins. Ewert sarcastically implies nefarious motives even for the provisions taken for the trip. Quote, 8 barrels of schnapps and wine were taken for inspiration. But to the chagrin of the gentlemen, we made little use of them, suggesting that the officials were trying to get them drunk. Before they even got to the homeland chosen for us, we got stuck in the swamps about 10 times and had to pull out first the horses and then the wagons with diplomats, ministers, and drivers all putting their shoulders to the wheel. Upon arrival in Pointe-aux-Chenes, Ewert is further unimpressed that a government building standing right next door, which was set up exactly to accommodate immigrants, was not open to admit us. So we were forced to pitch our tents in the mud and the rain. Only a kind Hudson Bay Post caretaker saved them from the rain in that building. Ewert was also not impressed by the fact that the wagons with the food got lost that first day and arrived past noon the next, so they made a short day finally getting to the boundary marker and seeing the reserve land, which he describes this way: a water table so high that the dugouts are brim full of water. Like that. Boulders abounding everywhere. Like that. Yes, these are all taken on the East Reserve. And a woodland of aspens, the thickest of which are not more than 8 inches in diameter. Not available in summer at all because they stood in a bog take that for timber. The second night, celebrated with hymns around the campfire, was uneventful. The next day they met Clear Spring settlers, whom he describes as having chosen nice places like that, and lured there as victims of unscrupulous agents. Bertha Mack was able to converse with them in German and encourage them to settle nearby. The next stretch south, however, was a nightmare of swamp, like that, and impassable coulees filled with water, forcing them to chase the horses across and pull the wagons through on the reins with everybody pushing. That was merely the prelude to a night that all the delegate narratives mention. But here I encountered a plague like almost never before in my life. Because it was muggy and rainy, the mosquitoes were so bloodthirsty that one had to suffer terribly from their bites. There was no thought of sleeping, and I spent the night smoking the tents of my traveling companions, using a frying pan filled with hot embers and grass to drive the mosquitoes out of them so that those who were less sensitive than I could at least get some sleep. I wrung my hands in desperation and whimpered in pain. In the morning, however, everyone still had swollen faces and hands from mosquito bites. The next morning, June 21st, Ewert and 5 others decided enough is enough and went back to Winnipeg the shortest way, which is via the Crowing Trail, which incidentally led across what is now my current yard. Look at the red dot. In Winnipeg, happily united with the American railway agent, Hiller, Ewert and the 5 delegates immediately get on the steamship for Fargo, and from there he writes this conclusion. For the reasons given, to which a great many drawbacks can be added, I consider it quite impossible to set up a settlement here. Some of the delegates, some of the deputies, however, seemed to have no eyes, ears, or feelings for all this, but rather expressed approval and willingness to lead their families into this wasteland. Emigration, yes, of course. America, sure, but not Manitoba. And while we may marvel at the detailed understanding that Ewert seems to have of the Manitoba situation, there is an irony in his conviction that a successful Mennonite settlement in Manitoba, particularly on the East Reserve, is not possible. But there are ironies. His own 2 sons, Heinrich and Benjamin, would spend a good part of their professional lives in Manitoba. Manitoba is now one of the largest concentrations of Russian Mennonites in the world. The East Reserve, yes, that's us. The arm of Hanover, with its towns, has the highest per capita charitable donations in Canada for the last generation at least, and probably before that. Speak about prosperity. And this conference in Winnipeg celebrates 150 years of Mennonite survival, achievement, and contribution to Manitoba and beyond. But it's not the end. Despite Ewert's judgment, 7,000 Mennonites did arrive in Manitoba in the 1870s.
Hello everyone, my name is Blake Hamm, and before I dive right in, I'd just like to say a quick word of acknowledgement, thanks to the people of Treaty 1, and I'd also like to acknowledge Elder Dave Scott's presence here today. Thank you. The title of my presentation is called Theology Visualizes Geography, the Settlements of the 1870s Migration, and I'll jump right in. Here's my argument, here's a map outlining some of the settlements. So my argument is that the settlements of the 1870s migration were a geographic visualization of the migrants' political and theological positions. The migrants' conservative liberal spectrum transposed itself into a north-south settlement pattern. And so background, shameless self-plug, see some of my previous works for further background, and I'll build on ideas I've outlined there, but 2 articles published in last year's volumes of the Journal of Mennonite Studies, one on the specific 1870s migration and one on Low German Mennonite migration in general. So my framework, I view Mennonite settlements as negotiated relationships. Mennonites seek toleration in the form of privileges from host states for their religion, custom, and ways of life. Host states grant privileges to induce settlement on marginal land. The more economically marginal the land, the greater the inducements needed to attract settlers. And the more economically preferable the land, then the land is more attractive for settlers, and hence fewer inducements are needed to secure settlement. And as territory becomes more economically viable, privileges and inducements are withdrawn, and national consolidation or assimilation begins. And just to quickly highlight this point, I'd like to say a shout out on the live stream to our Mennonite cousins down in McPherson, Kansas. The forecast yesterday was 93 degrees Fahrenheit over 30 degrees Celsius, and the low was 57. They don't have a privilegium down there. I think they're doing all right. Here in Winnipeg, and we're still the first week of October, and our high yesterday was lower than their low in McPherson, and our low was near freezing. But we have a privilegium. Conservatives and liberals, I have some brief descriptors on indicators of conservative Mennonites. Conservatives tend to be more separatist and isolationist from the general population. They prioritize legal guarantees of ethno-religious values over economic advantages. They migrate early, often, and voluntarily where pull factors predominate in the form of privilegia and the availability of land. They're first in and they're first out. Indicators of more conservative Mennonites are more migrations and earlier settlements, and I'll point to Khortytsa in Russia that was founded in 1789. For liberal Mennonites, they tend to be more associative and engaging with wider society. They have a greater emphasis on economic advantages, and they're more reconciliatory towards national consolidation, such as learning the local language and engaging in forms of alternate service. They migrate later and less frequently with less pull and more push. Indicators, fewer migrations and later settlements, such as Molochna, the other major colony in Russia, founded some 15 years after Khortytsa. I'll briefly touch on what I think are some unique factors of the 1870s migration. We think of terms as Canada and United States. Of course, that's a colonial construct. We drove down to Fargo last week, and the 49th parallel is really just a line drawn in a field. We're dealing with the Great Plains, which is one geographic body divided by two countries, Canada and the United States, and 5 states, provinces, or Dakota Territory, so 5 sub-administrative units. And so in the 1870s migration, you had Mennonite groups simultaneously migrate to a wider region. This differs from past staggered migrations of different groups to the same locale. Now, I want to make the point here that most Mennonites had similar values but differed in their priorities. So I want to say that conservatives are not poor and simple, but also liberals are not unprincipled in their religious beliefs. As Aileen hinted earlier this morning, there can be a little bit of disagreement amongst Mennonites, but I'd say that most migrants had the same values. It's just a matter of trade-offs, and I do find it interesting if you do get into the primary sources. Even the Mennonite delegates that went to the United States, most of them asked for exactly or very close to the same guarantees and privileges as Canada gave them. They just weren't willing to sacrifice the coming to Manitoba, as Ernie aptly pointed out, for those guarantees. And so in the 1870s migration, your geography becomes an indicator of which values had more weight. And so locales, I divided this into three. So the first I call Manitoba in the north. The mid will be Minnesota and then the Dakota Territory, and then the south is Nebraska and Kansas. So in the north, Manitoba, we all know this. We have the worst climate and least economically favorable land from a Western perspective. It had the lowest population, the most isolation, and the worst market access. And depending on which group you are, this more isolation could be a good thing, could be a not so good thing. There was no railroad and little infrastructure in the 1870s, but it did have the best guarantees of religious freedom and block settlement in the Privilegium, the Low Letter of 1873 from the Canadian government. And so your Mennonite settlers were the Old Colony, the Bergtal Colony, and a majority of the Kleine Gemeinde. The south, Kansas and Nebraska, had the most temperate climate and most appealing land economically. It had high population and good market access, but less isolation. You had the established railroads in the Santa Fe and Burlington. There was a military exemption, but there wasn't really any other prospect of other privileges. And so your Mennonite settlers were Prussians, some from the Malachna colony, including all of Alexanderville, the Krimmer Mennonite Brethren, and some Volhynians, both Swiss and Low German. And in the middle, Dakota Territory and Minnesota, you did have the local St. Paul and Pacific. As well, there was the impending construction of the Northern Pacific for a transcontinental railroad. There was a military exemption in Minnesota, which was a state. There was the prospect of additional privileges. So Dakota Territory, there was a contract, there was a bill that went before United States Congress that would have allowed for block settlement with the Northern Pacific Railroad. It was ultimately scuttled. But in what's now South Dakota, there was no railroad holdings, so that allowed for bulk purchase of land. The Minnesota legislature passed a unanimous motion pledging to secure Mennonites the largest religious and political privileges allowed. So again, it's not quite Kansas and Nebraska, but it's also not the north in Canada, but you do have Minnesota saying, hey, maybe we should get on this privilege bandwagon. And so your Mennonite settlers were from Crimea in 1873, also some from Malachna, the Kuban, Volhynia, and the entire Hutterite colony, both communal and non-communal, and later joined by some from the Bergtal colony. I'll spend the balance of my presentation just touching briefly on the different groups of Mennonite migrants, and it's always an occupational hazard, but I will try my best not to stick my foot in my mouth. I'll start with the future Old Colony Mennonites. And I think it's important to note that the Old Colony did not exist pre-migration. They only formed after migrating. They're typically seen as the most conservative. They were formed after migrating to Canada, and their origins were from Khortytsa and its daughter colony Furstenland. So again, if we're going by indicators of culture, this would be an earlier migration, generally a more conservative indicator. They did not send a delegate in 1873. They chose Canada sight unseen based on reports from the Bergtal colony. And so their result of a migration was the formation of a new Gemeinde. And so, to me, it begs the question, it's a change to a new locale to preserve old ways. So, to me, it's radical means to attain conservative ends, and I think it begs the question, what is conservative, right? In one hand, perhaps very theologically conservative, but using very radical means to get there. The Bergtal colony, more conservative. They were founded in 1836 as a daughter colony of Khortytsa. So again, you have more indicators of more conservative leanings. They migrated en masse to Manitoba, split between the East and West Reserve. And there's this quote here recorded by Hutterite delegate Paul Schetter, but it's on Heinrich Wiebe, from Heinrich Wiebe, a Bergtal delegate, where he says that he thought the English government would be more liberal and grant a charter guaranteeing exemption from military service, which was better than the United States. And it's this oft-quoted passage that one should not only consider the land question, but also not forget the matter of freedom, for that is the reason why we came to this country and are making this long journey. And it is worth noting that after hearing everything about Manitoba from William Ewert, Heinrich Wiebe was right there. He saw the same thing. So it's a testament to where his priorities were. And so the Bergtal colony's results of migration was the maintenance of community, although it was split geographically, and there were further geographic and theological divisions in the 1890s. Prussian Mennonites were the most liberal. They had remained in the Vistula Delta after Prussian annexation, and as privileges were gradually eroded throughout the 19th century, these Mennonites had never left Prussia to go to Russia. They had lived in mixed Prussian villages and socially integrated with the general population. Again, they didn't live on enclosed Mennonite colonies in Russia. So about 1,000 migrated to North America with William Ewert. We have this quote again that Ernie already read out, but about the mosquitoes and how I wrung my hands in desperation and whimpered in pain. So he settled in Kansas. And the thing I find most interesting about the Prussian Mennonites is they're the most liberal of migrants, but they're also the most conservative of the Prussian Mennonites. If you read William Ewert in the context of the Delegates, he seems very liberal, but if you read him in the context of the Prussian migrants in 1873-74, he comes across as a little bit of a stodgy conservative, which is to say that with Mennonites, context matters. Alexander Vollers, so they had their mother church, and I will butcher that if I try to pronounce it, but they migrated en masse from Vistula Delta to Malachna, and again from Russia to Kansas. And to me, it's interesting, it's a repeated mass group migration of a more liberal community. I think sometimes we tend to associate group migrations with more conservative, but this is a group migration on the more liberal side of the spectrum. Kleine Gemeinde, I'm running out of time, but I find them interesting. They defy any neat categorization. They're from a daughter colony of Malachna. They indicated a preference to migrate to the United States, but their delegates recommended Canada. They did not compel members where to migrate. So you have liberal indicators, but then they most choose Canada. And you have Cornelius Taves saying, we're proceeding to Ottawa. We have the expectation that there's nothing more satisfactory to our questions to be obtained anywhere than exactly here in Manitoba. But then you have Abram Clausen saying, why such a group of people could want to settle in an area where even the Americans do not dare to go and settle in such a wasteland. And so their migration exacerbated existing divisions in the community. They migrated to 3 locations: the East Reserve in Manitoba, which is a block settlement but nearest Winnipeg, the Scratching River settlement in Manitoba, the only Mennonite settlement in Manitoba not on a reserve, and the Jefferson County, Nebraska, where they later transplanted to Kansas for isolation from other Mennonites, which begs the question, are they the most liberal of conservatives or the most conservative of liberals? Hutterites, I'll just like to just quickly point out that so their entire community of 1,200 migrated to Dakota Territory, and Paul Schetter played a big role. He petitioned President Grant for closed colonies and exemption from military and jury duty. He decided on Dakota Territory regardless of congressional approval of block settlement. And they face the challenge of unity, communal versus non-communal Hutterites, and also evangelical Mennonites. Again, I think the role that Hutterites played in this migration is often understated and is worth looking into. I think I'm out of time, but Low German Volhynians, just very briefly, about 75% left Russia. The elder Tobias Unruh was the last to leave Russia to fulfill his duties. That resulted in a scattered migration to Dakota and Kansas, as arriving migrants were targeted by railroad agents without their leadership present. Tobias Underon never entered Kansas, and so to me this underscores the role of church leadership and railroad agents. Even so, there's more to just theology, but I do find that interesting. Volhynians, most left Russia and settled in Kansas and Dakota Territory. Of course, the relatively small number of Crimmer brethren that proliferated through missions to other Mennonites. And I'll get to my conclusion. So the 1870s Anabaptist migration was the simultaneous intertwining of theology, politics, economics, and geography. The conservative liberal spectrum of ethno-religious values versus economic concerns manifested itself into a north-south settlement pattern along the Great Plains of North America from Manitoba to Kansas. And if you have questions, feedback, or if you want some legal advice, I'm here for you. There's another shameless plug to end. Thank you.
Well, hello, folks. Hope you're all doing well this morning or this afternoon, whatever we are. I think that my talk will connect quite nicely with Ernie's and Blake's. As I've been listening, there's a lot of points of connection and even one map that we have in common here. During the 1870s, if I've learned how to use this correctly, there we go. The Canadian government reserved approximately 1.3 million acres of land in Manitoba for 11 European immigrant colonies. 2 of these reserve colonies were for Mennonites, of which I have to tell nobody here. One was the East Reserve and the other was the West Reserve. While this practice was not unique to the Mennonite case, they did represent the most successful application of this method of colonization. None of the other reserves, including the one that I've studied in most detail, the Icelandic Reserve, were as successful. And in fact, most of them were abject failures. I'll finish up this morning by telling you about one of those spectacular failures. But first, to place these colonization reserves in context, I got to tell you something about where they came from. The advent of colonization reserves can be dated from September 1872, when the federal government signaled its intention to set aside 100,000 acres, or up to 100,000 acres, in Manitoba or the Northwest Territories for colonists from Switzerland brought out by a certain Dr. Foos. I don't know who he was. I'm going to say he was the inventor of foosball. In October, a German colonization plan supported by the German Society of Montreal was approved, and in November, the government granted 2 townships for Scottish settlers to be brought out by immigration agent Colonel David Shaw. At this stage, in late 1872, specific lands were not being reserved. They were instead promises to reserve lands should the promoters be able to actually bring immigrants to the Northwest. This changed in March of 1873 when Township 13 4 West was reserved for immigrants from Germany, and the whole of what became the East Reserve was reserved for, quote, the exclusive use by settlement of Germans in Russia, Mennonites, and others, end quote. Over the next 6 years, the other colonization reserves were established for French Canadians living in the United States, English and Welsh settlers, for Danes, for Icelanders, and then the second Mennonite Reserve in 1876, that is the West Reserve. So these reserves were established not by bills passed in the Canadian Parliament, but rather by orders in council. An order in council is, according to the Government of Canada's website, a legal instrument made by the governor in council pursuant to statutory authority, which is a fancy way of saying that they are legally binding regulations that fall within the scope of existing laws. Among the matters that orders in council are used for are transactions between government and the private sector. And that's particularly relevant in these cases because colonization reserves were conceived of as a sort of public-private partnership, or 3P to use today's terminology. More on that shortly. So the statutory authority that lay behind the creation of the reserves was, by order in council, came from 2 sources. The 1870 Manitoba Act, which placed Crown lands in Manitoba under the authority of the federal government, and the 1872 Dominion Lands Act, the law governing the redistribution of Indigenous lands in Manitoba and the Northwest Territories through sales and grants of various kinds, including homesteads. The original version of the Dominion Lands Act did not mention reserving blocks of land for colonization projects, but the government could remove particular blocks of land, and so did it by order in council. That was within their power. In 1874, the Act was amended to have a specific regulations around group settlements. If any person or persons undertake to settle any of the public lands of the Dominion free of expense to the government in the proportion of one family to each alternate quarter section, or not less than 64 families in any one township, under the homestead provisions of the Act hereby amended, the Governor and Council may withdraw such townships from public sale or general settlement. In short, in return for bringing in settlers, the colony and paying to bring them out, the colony's promoter had the option to purchase lands in the reserved townships at a reduced price. The idea was to encourage private investment in immigration by giving the private investor the opportunity to acquire land below the fixed government price for Crown land. As the assisted settlers improved their lands, the company's lands would increase in value, and they would be able to realize a profit, the company that is, off land sales when their sections were sold to either the existing settlers or new immigrants coming in. It's a kind of land speculation sort of arrangement. The 1874 amendment also contained a clause stating that the costs for transportation, subsistence, the construction of buildings, seed implements could be made a charge on the homestead of the immigrant, which had to be paid with interest before the settler could obtain patent to their land. So the maximum amount of the principal was set at $200, which today, $12,000–$15,000 about, and the maximum interest rate was 6%. So the investor could potentially recoup their initial investment on bringing the immigrants out, and then later realize profit through land sales. The federal government's motivation in doing this was to offload some of the costs and risks associated with colonization onto the private sector. The public contribution came in the form of free or cheap lands, and the government hoped by this mix of private investment and public subsidies that it would help expedite the colonization of Manitoba by farming families. But where did the idea come from? Canadian colonization policy is in general plagiarized from the United States, full stop. So it's no surprise that that was the inspiration in this case as well. John Henry Pope, who was the first, he initiated the plan because he was Minister of Agriculture in the government of Sir John A. Macdonald, and at that time agriculture was responsible for immigration. Pope submitted a memorandum to Cabinet on the Swiss colonies in September 1872. So he was, in the first instance, the one bringing it forward to Cabinet saying we should pass this. But he was likely informed by John Lowe, who many of you will know from Lowe Farm, the promoter of Lowe Farm. This is him. He was the senior civil servant responsible for immigration and also had a hand in initially initiating the colonization policy. The new policy is not mentioned in Pope's reports for 1872, not mentioned in the minutes of the Senate Parliamentary Committee on Immigration and Colonization, where Lowe testified at length. There were no parliamentary debates on the subject because of an election that happened at that time. So all that is missing. We don't have that context. But we do have a really interesting clue as to where Pope and Lowe might have got the idea. There's a lot going on in this slide, but I'll unpack it bit by bit. The person in the top left is Gilbert Malcolm Sproat, who was Agent General for British Columbia in London, tirelessly promoting that province to prospective immigrants. Sproat is best known for his later role as BC Indian Reserve Commissioner during the latter half of the 1870s. Cole Harris dedicated his award-winning 2002 book, Making Native Space, to Sproat's memory, referring to him as a colonizer who eventually listened. But before Sproat was settling the boundaries of Indian reserves in British Columbia, he was actively promoting colonization as an immigration agent. He visited Ottawa in January 1872, and again in March, and created a letter. Calling it a letter is a bit of a stretch. It runs about 80 pages, and it has all kinds of attachments in it, outlining his ideas for colonization in the Northwest. So basically his plan was what he called farming colonies. Sproat requested that Parliament reserve 1 million acres to be divided into 100,000 acre parcels and then granted to private land companies that would coordinate the immigration and colonization process, receiving a commission for their efforts. And, oh, by the way, I would also like to propose I will create a company myself, Sproat said, called the Central Canadian Land Company. Sproat argued that group settlement was preferable to individual settlement. Farm colonies could be a force for morality, progress, and nation building in contexts where the bonds of civilization had become tenuous and fragmented. He referred in particular to how individual settlers had caused their governments enormous trouble and expense by inconsiderate treatment of the Aborigines. That's his quote. And he advocated humane and just policy, which would also bring about greater separation between settlers and Indigenous people. Sproat advocated this as an antidote to disorganization and isolation. He said, organized colonies controlling large tracts seemed to have special facilities for keeping the houses together in small villages or hamlets. He believed this would allow families of settlers to live in society instead of solitude, and therefore contribute to the moral uplift and material progress of settlers and their children. In addition to family migration, he believed group settlement would work best when old ties of kin, community, and religion and social beliefs were transplanted. He said the colonies would be composed sometimes of men of one religion, or all pledged to temperance or connected by some bond of that sort, but usually families from the same locality, generally old neighbors and acquaintances, who once they were located would attract to their settlements annually a considerable number of recruits from their former home, end quote. So where did Sproat get this idea? His inspiration was the colonization policies of the Northern Pacific Railroad and other railroad companies in the United States, which Blake mentioned actually too. So in the United States, the practice was for the government to give the railroads land, and then the railroads would hire a colonization company to oversee the settlement of those lands along the line of the railway. And and Sproat said, though I do not affirm what is proper for a corporation is necessarily proper for a government, the Canadian government might safely follow their steps. And he said, it's best to leave this to the private sector, essentially. And he used examples from the United States, and one is this Red River Gazette, which was a newspaper from Glendon in Minnesota, promoting this Red River colony in where you can see the location of it. It's roughly the same latitude as Duluth, but it's within Minnesota, and it shows the lines of the railroads that connect to it. And in the excerpt from the newspaper, you see colony towns, and it's colony lands. It's essentially just an advertisement for this particular colonization project. Up in the top, you have Sproat's first letter with some marginal notes, which were either made by John Pope or Lowe or one of the other officials in the Department of Immigration. So we know that Sproat first recommended privately organized farming colonies of 100,000 acres each in March 1872. 6 months later, Cabinet endorsed a plan to settle people from Switzerland in the West based on that model. So it seems likely, although we don't have, I don't have a letter that says, hey, let's use Sproat's ideas. It seems that's where Pope and Lowe got the idea. There was speaking to the Standing Committee on Immigration and Colonization in 1878, Lowe said that the government's policies had been modeled on the methods used by railway and land companies in the Western United States. So it seems like, yeah, if he wasn't following Sproat's advice exactly, it was sort of an inspiration that led them to implement this policy. So earlier I mentioned that most of these colonization reserves were failures. I realize a lot of my slides have increasingly elaborate facial hair on the subjects. Here's a real epic one. So there were two general reasons for this. The promoters didn't have the money to actually put their plans into effect. They were very enthusiastic about making money off land in the West, but they didn't actually have the capital to invest to make it happen. And they were also not able to recruit immigrants because they weren't actually connected to communities that might want to immigrate, unlike people like William Ewert and the other delegates who came in 1873. In recommending to the Minister of the Interior that David Shaw's Scottish Colonization Reserve be cancelled, Surveyor General J.S. Dennis wrote, quote, "Colonel Shaw devoted much time and attention to furthering the objects of the scheme, but failed in achieving any practical result beyond a theoretical organization of a company known as the British and Canadian Land Settlement Company." Colonel Shaw died in 1876, and his obituary noted that he found considerable difficulty in raising the necessary amount of stock. Shaw was a merchant and dry goods a businessman in Kingston. He was also an officer in the Canadian militia. He was a business partner of Johnny Macdonald and a political friend of Johnny Macdonald, which partly explains why he got the grant. And it also, I kept reading the correspondence, like, why are they giving him so much time? Like, he clearly it's not happening. But J.S. Dennis was Lieutenant Colonel J.S. Dennis, also a militia officer. So there was some buddy-buddy relations in the fact that they were all connected to the militia, connected to the Conservative Party, and that's what allowed this grant to continue until Shaw died, and then they said, nothing is actually going to happen here. So to conclude, the Mennonite reserves of the 1870s must be understood within this larger context. The Canadian government was already moving in the direction of group colonization before the Mennonite delegates, including Grumpy William Ewert, arrived in Manitoba in 1873. The Mennonites became exceptions to the rule of what was otherwise largely a failed colonization policy. Thank you.
Go back. Does it go back? There we go. I'm clearly the shortest one on our panel. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission has issued a clarion call for the settler population of Canada to enter into relationship with Indigenous peoples. The calls to action invite us to address the harms experienced by colonialism and to comprehensively address all elements of our shared social, economic, cultural, and political story. Just how shared our story is becomes particularly evident during the settlement period of the 1870s and the creation of the Privilegium and the Treaties. I am a third-generation Mennonite settler scholar. I live and work on the boundary of Treaty 1 and Treaty 2 territories. My house and office are powered by hydroelectricity, which comes from Treaty 5 territories in northern Manitoba, where the impacts of the hydroelectric dams continue to impact their lives and ability to fish. I might never have understood my role as a settler during the era of treaty making as clearly, except for my experiences as a child at the community of Pongashi, where I was privileged to live with and learn from an Anishinaabe community whose teachings, worldviews, and perspectives continue to inform all I am. I will be forever grateful. I'm a Latin American scholar who, because of this life experience, has become involved with the historical documents recovery project. That was our home. The store was the front, the home was the back. I've become a part of an historical documents recovery project for the Anishinaabe communities of Island Lake and the surrounding region. As part of this recovery project, I've been asked to explore the treaty-making processes for that region, which is Treaty 5 and Treaty 5 adhesion. Legal experts all argue that treaties were closely connected and cannot be analyzed individually. So I've been reading all the treaties. While reading through Treaty 3 documents, I was suddenly stopped short. Rather than the names and activities of people involved in the negotiations around the Lake of the Woods, I found myself. Or to be more specific, I found a reference to my great-grandparents. In a few brief paragraphs following treaty negotiations and updates, the Superintendent General recorded high praise on a group of newcomer settlers who, in their opinion, would be highly successful. I cannot close this report, they say, without referring to the very satisfactory settlement made by the German Mennonites from southern Russia, i.e. us. Although 8 townships were set apart at the instance of the Minister of the Interior in the year 1873 for their exclusive settlements, no considerable number of them arrived in Manitoba until the summer of 1874. Although I'd always intellectually understood the role of colonialism, settlers, and the rise of treaty making, which has had such destructive impacts on the Indigenous peoples of Rupert's Land, to see it in stark black and white on paper was very unsettling. What I've come to see is the Treaty 5 negotiations were being driven by the government's need to create a railway through to the Red River settlement in Winnipeg so that my great-grandparents had easier access to the vast prairie lands. What are the implications of this clear connection between the arrival of our ancestors during the 1870s, the privilegium that guaranteed the central Mennonite theological and social tenets, and the era of treaty making for Indigenous communities? Winona Wheeler, in their 2018 foreword to Sheldon Krasowski's book, No Surrender, The Land Remains Indigenous, stated, "We don't need any more allies, we need accomplices." Here, Wheeler cautions that all histories of the treaty-making era must include Indigenous stories, both documented and oral. Following Wheeler's call to decolonize Canada's foundational stories, I will address the 1870s, calling us all to re-examine the colonial influences that have been embedded in all of our consciousness. Now, this can be a challenging story. I've talked to my parents about it. We've cried about it because it involves our identity as colonial actors implicated in the harms of others. I would like to introduce a concept that I have found helpful to deal with this historic reality. I heard this from my professor at Princeton Theological Seminary, Dr. Christian Becker, who I will love forever. As a teenage Dutch Christian, Dr. Becker was faced with this fundamental question during World War II. He joined the Dutch resistance, spent time in a concentration camp, and then years hiding in an attic, waiting for the war to end. The remainder of his life, he was condemned to wrestle with this powerful question of how do we live in moments that are bigger than us. We talked about this concept as students through the lens of African slavery and the history of that horror in the United States. While none of us in the room were directly responsible for the sin of owning another human being, those of us who inhabited and were privileged by the color of our skin within institutional structures that were the descendants of that slave-owning period, we continue to be privileged. And so Dr. Becker encouraged us to reflect on our institutional privilege, not our individual actions, because we weren't there and we didn't do it. But what do we do with that legacy now, right? That was the question that he helped us talk about. For the sake of clarity, I will focus on 4 interrelated and interconnected processes ever so briefly. During the creation of Manitoba, you have treaties. You have the Hudson Bay Company in Rupert's Land. You have territorial sovereignty and the Mennonites and privilegium, and I realize there's many more issues at hand here. The arrival of Mennonite colonial agriculturalists to settle open and unpopulated spaces was just one small chapter in a global process that had been occurring since the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494, which literally divided the world without regard for anyone who was not European or Christian. identified by different names such as natural law in Spain and parts of Europe, the doctrine of discovery here. The European world held a view that peoples inhabited a hierarchical continuum where those who were Christian lived in social and political hierarchies and were literate, were inherently superior to those who did not and lived in different kinds of ways. The most problematic piece of this was that these ideas were held to be self-evident, so that I should know it and you should know it, and you should understand where you sit on this continuum. As Edward Said states so eloquently, imperialism was the theory, colonialism the practice of changing useless, unoccupied territories of the world, in their view, into useful new versions of the European metropolitan society. John Staples reminds us in his recent work on Johann Corny's The Mennonites and the Russian Colonialism in Southern Ukraine, Mennonites had already been involved in this kind of process as they moved eastward into the Tsarist Empire. Here he talks about the grasslands of the world open to agricultural settlement in places as diverse as Argentina, the United States, Canada, South Africa, and Russia. People set out to colonize these empty spaces. Here's where we find our Mennonite ancestors as just one of these many European settler groups who came to the Americas. During the years following the formal creation of the Dominion of Canada in 1867, a series of fragmentary, chaotic, and contradictory processes occurred, and the formation of Manitoba was a complex array of negotiations with a wide variety of actors. The most important issue was the creation of the Rupert's Land Act of 1868, which occurred 1 year after Dominion was settled. This directly relates to the creation of the province of Manitoba. It was passed by the Parliament in the UK, which transferred the entirety of this territory to Canada, 3.9 million square kilometers. This transaction, known as the Deed of Surrender, was concluded much like the Royal Charter, which created it originally, without the involvement or consent of the diverse Indigenous peoples who called this area home. Although many expressed their anger, objection, and resistance to Canada's claims of authority and ownership of the land, the deed had been done and the geography of Canada was changed forever. The second issue that plays a role in the creation of our province is one of territorial sovereignty. In the first years of the Canadian colonial state, the immediate need of establishing sovereignty became very evident. The boundaries of individual provinces was one of utmost political interest. It was also deeply concerning for those in Canada because of the United States, which was actively pursuing expansionist ideology, which at times threatened Canada's very existence, particularly in the West. Within this process, there was a great deal of concern and conversation over who should settle this land. Indigenous peoples who are already populating this region were frequently eager to adopt agricultural practices. However, the Indian Act did a lot to impede their ability to do this. It's a large story for another time. The government then turned to the challenge of finding immigrants to secure the land for dominion. This included the devastating practice of clearing the plains of the vast bison herds. Over a period of about 10 years, 60 million, more or less, were reduced to 60 million bison were reduced to a literal handful, and they almost succeeded in wiping out the species. The bottom line here was Canada was eager to populate the prairies with European agriculturalists who could discern or create discernible markers of modernization and colonial habitation through the cultivation of soils. So these are the kinds of advertisements they sent out across Europe and the United States. However, the true nature of the intent of the Canadian government was made clear through several infamous moments during this time period. Two that are very clear was the amount of African Americans who came from the South because they were anxious to leave Reconstruction in the Jim Crow era, and they settled places in Saskatchewan, Alberta. They were in many cases forced out, and Canada immediately stopped advertising because of their arrival. The other obvious issues were turning away ships from both China and India on the west coast because of that concern. The third issue I want to talk about is the issue of treaties. In order to prepare for the settlers who they wanted, the government had to negotiate treaties with Indigenous peoples who inhabited this land. As many scholars have pointed out, despite the consistent request for treaty relationships with the Crown and the Canadian government by Indigenous communities who were eager to establish a shared sense of their rights within this rapidly changing political system, the state only acted when it felt its own interests were at stake. I will just talk about two examples here. I forgot about this last part. Here, Clifford Sifton makes it very clear what kind of immigrants they are wanting. When I speak of quality, I have in mind something that is quite different from what is in mind of average writer or speaker. I think of the stalwart peasant in a sheepskin coat, born to the soil, whose forefathers have been farmers for 10 generations with a stout wife and half a dozen children, is good quality. All of my great-grandparents' photos look exactly like what he just described. We fit the bill perfectly. During the Treaty 5 negotiations between the Anishinaabe groups along the route needed for the railway and the government's treaty, it was actually the Anishinaabe leaders who were initiating these negotiations because the government was just trying to move through a railway system, and the Indigenous communities from this region were very concerned about the impacts of what that would have on their traditional hunting and fishing territories, and so they were the ones who actually forced the government into treaty negotiations. The other, just the other example, in my work on Treaty 5 adhesions in northern Manitoba, for about 30 years, communities from Island Lake, Oxford House, God's Lake, Tatasquiac, York Factory, Churchill, all kept asking for treaty. They wanted to get an education, they wanted to work with medical systems, they were very much involved with all of this, and they kept getting no. It was only when the government decided they need a railway from the south part of Manitoba up to the ports to transfer grain from the southern Manitoba that they started working with the communities to put treaties into place. So where does this leave us with our own story and our privilegium? Mennonites occupy a curious position in Canada during this critical period. They both represented the ideal settler envisioned by the new Canadian state, European, Christian, agriculturalists. But Mennonites also, because of the privilegium and our own theological tenets, occupied an inherently non-political position, right? We wanted to work the land, but we did not want to engage with the government directly through military service and other kinds of things. So Mennonites held a really curious and interesting place within this process. As stated by historian Frank Tuff, the government of Canada did not have a well-defined treaty policy. Rather, Canada's treaties were cobbled together by relying on the knowledge of a vast array of actors, and most historians point to a trend that Canada engaged in treaty making only when forced to, by pressures of settlement, for example. Therefore, the privilegium can be contextualized within this conflicting set of processes. The government wanted our Mennonite ancestors, and they created a treaty or privilegium to get what they wanted. However, as we almost all know, the Mennonites didn't escape the homogenizing policies that the government envisioned, because even as the privilegium was enacted, it was ultimately violated. Right? We were, unable to educate in our own language anymore. My grandmother tells me stories of when that changed, and she literally stopped going to school after that point. Third, returning to the concepts of personal sin versus social evil, this is a moment in which we can expand our story to understand our role and participation within the colonial settler structures. Mennonites have often perceived themselves to be victims of martyrs of violence and oppressive political systems, which has been true. But as John Staples reminds us, in the context of the Russian experience, the story these Mennonites preserved was one of faith and suffering. Filtered through the Russian and Soviet experiences, it stressed religion and sense of community. It, however, ignored the role in the larger Russian story of colonization and economic development. I argue all of these realities can be true at the same time. And we at this moment can acknowledge, as we're acknowledging the 150 years since our arrival, something I personally feel a great deal of gratitude about, we can now take up the challenge to identify our history and our roles here in more complex ways, understanding our relationships to the variety of political systems in which we found ourselves and to the first peoples of this land. Thank you.
Thank you to all of the presenters, and now we will have time for questions. So mics will be circulating, and you can just raise your hand and ask questions of our presenters.
Hi, I just wanted to follow up on those all excellent presentations that really added to my knowledge base, that's for sure. But I wanted to check or ask Patricia Harms if you know, when the colonization happened, we had Ernest telling the story of the scouts coming, and they were all bothered by mosquitoes and swamps. I'm wondering if the earlier settlers, earliest colonists from Ukraine, were at all bothered by what had happened to the land that they were moving onto. Were they aware that some people had been dislodged? Did that become a concern at all for any of them? Or is this like a modern 21st century concern among children of the colonists?
Right.
Thanks.
Yeah. No, I think all of that is also true, and that's another really important part of the story to raise up, is those personal relationships that were developing and were happening, and the concern that was being expressed within those intimate spaces rather than the big, story that was going on. So from everything I know, and I will be happy to be wrong, but I believe, yes, that is also happening simultaneously. Yeah.
We'll take a question up top.
This is for Ernie. Wilhelm Ewert, with his aversion to mosquitoes, am I correct in thinking his sons were Heinrich and Benjamin, who were associated with the Mennonite Collegiate Institute in Gretna? And Heinrich, in fact, is buried in the cemetery in Gretna.
I couldn't hear the question.
Oh, could you? It was about the sons, the Ewert sons, and their.
Wilhelm's son, were they Benjamin? Well, you did indicate there were Benjamin and Heinrich, but were they the same? Is it the same Heinrich Ewert who was the principal at MCI for years?
Yes, Benjamin was, I think, eventually the archivist of the Mennonite archives, but Heinrich H. was the principal of the Gretna school and what is now MCI. So yes, both of those guys were actually here almost all of their professional lives.
Thank you.
More questions?
As a question for Patty Harms, thank you for that very interesting and lively and engaged paper. Are you involved in any political actions coming out of this realization of Mennonite implications for, as colonizers of Indigenous peoples, like land back movement or anything like that? Or do you have suggestions of where to go with that?
Yeah. The Historical Documents Recovery Project has really become a place of shared storytelling for us. And I have felt incredibly honored. It happened kind of through a series of accidents that we met, and I met the right people, and I've become a part of this. And it's really helped me develop a stronger sense of our shared story. And so I have been presenting, it's just felt like the recovery of information and the story that has been so ruptured for so many communities over the last 100 years, just returning that feels like it's repairing the thread. We're reweaving. And the goal is to create stories that weave both oral and historical documents together. So it's been and it was initiated by the community. I was asked, so I work for them. I serve them in my capacity as a historian. Yeah.
Okay, we have a question up here.
Yeah, mine is for Ryan. Speaking about movements, I'm thinking about the 1920s when we have a large movement of using Blake Hamm's kind of thesis of more conservative groups. They're first out when the Thornton Act and the Manitoba Schools Act changes the way schools structure, and so people leave and go to South America and Central America to find new space where they can live in those freedoms. I visited the new Iceland Heritage Museum this summer, and they talk about a movement away from the Icelandic settlement on Lake Winnipeg around the same time. Was that for similar reasons, or was it for other type of economic collapse, as you were mentioning?
Oh, there were all kinds of problems in New Iceland, but Icelanders also did have a religious controversy where there was a split, and the split was essentially between allying with the Norwegian Lutheran Church in the US or maintaining an alliance with the Icelandic State Church, which is a Lutheran church is established in Iceland. It's an arm of the state. So that was the religious context for that, which happened in the 1870s, late 1870s. And so some of the people who advocated allying with the Norwegian church in the US moved to Pembina County, North Dakota at that time. So that's the origins of the Icelandic settlements in Pembina County.
Awesome, thank you.
Okay, I believe we have a question over here.
This is for Blake. I liked your thesis of north-south settlement. I'm wondering, do you lump the East Reserve and West Reserve together in the northern part of your idea system, or were there differences between the East and West Reserves as well?
Thank you. Great question, and for the purpose of a 15-minute presentation, I tried to have three broad locales: the north, the south, the middle. But of course, then when I went into the different migrant groups, I tried to touch on some of the differences between the groups. And certainly there's differences between the Kleine Gemeinde in the East Reserve and the old colony that formed in the West Reserve, and of course the Bergtal colony split between the two. Yeah.
Okay, we have a question up here.
Yes, first of all, thank you to all speakers. It was very interesting. Question I have maybe for the first three, one of the first three could answer that. Is there any evidence of these delegates or these expeditions that went out to scout the lands, that they benefited economically from their decisions to bring communities into a specific colony?
Go ahead, Blake.
That's a very good question, and very different there's some controversy and even some lawsuits that started in the United States with Michael Hiller. He was an agent of the Northern Pacific, and if you look into the documents, the Northern Pacific and Jay Cook, he financed the U.S. Civil War and then tried to finance the Northern Pacific. It went bankrupt September 1873. But yes, railroad agents were paid. There is some documentation and some controversy over whether William Hespler or the fellow in Hamburg would be paid for the Canadian migrants. But yes, there were some economic benefits flowing. I'm not sure if it's necessarily to the 12, we think of the 12 delegates, but certainly some after. In fact, there's some, I believe, Bergtaler Mennonites that were diverted to Mountain Lake, Minnesota. And there's a story that's passed around through oral history, and it was in a preservings issue a few issues back, where some Mennonites, they're on their way to North America, they stop in Minneapolis, they have lunch with somebody who came in 1873, and he takes them back to the train, and they continue on their way, except it was the wrong train. And apologies, I can't remember whose article that was in, but yes, that it was in a preservings article a couple issues back.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Oh, over here.
At what point did this delegation that came affect other Mennonites that came and that ended up going to Saskatchewan?
You'll forgive me for, I'm a little rusty, but my grandfather was born in Rostern, Saskatchewan, and so those reserves started opening up in the 1890s, I believe, Ernie?
Yeah.
Ryan?
After the 1885 war.
Yeah, after the 1885 war. And interestingly enough, Rostern, a point of personal interest, but there's 3 battles right in the vicinity, and it's interesting, but if you map it out, like Duck Lake, Batoche, and another one that escapes my memory, Rostern is right smack dab in the middle of all 3 locales, and it was settled just 6 years later.
Thank you.
I'm Dick Braun from Osler, Saskatchewan. I am in the heart of where this question is going. The Hague-Osler Mennonite Reserve was started in 1895. The first people arrived there in May of 1895 and formed the village of Noyanlag. Then, by 1900, all the homesteads had been taken up in that area, and then the Swift Reserve was started around in southern Saskatchewan, and that was in 1905, and then that reserve also filled up. And the interesting thing is that this whole rebellion had happened by the time our people got there, but the effects of that was that railroad got built from Regina to Prince Albert, and that's how our people got there from here, by that rail.
Any final questions from the audience? If not, then let's thank our panelists for a wonderful illumination of colonization.